Chapter 3 Mirka woke to her new puppy gnawing on his splint. Half asleep, she laughed, pulling him close against her side. "Oh, stop that, Scout!" The puppy barked and twisted in her hands to lick her face. "And were you a good boy while I slept?" Scout barked again, bouncing on her bed. He jumped towards the edge, then bounced back to her, and did it again. "You want to get down?" He barked again, licking her face. She hooked her hand around his chest and set him gently on the ground. He immediately ran, limping to the door, pushing up on his good hind leg to scratch at the surface. "You need to relieve yourself?" She pulled on her dressing gown and took him out to the balcony garden. He ran to the nearest flower pot, pulling himself difficultly up into the pot, and disappeared back into the thick flowering bushes. While he rustled around the plants, she leaned on the balcony rail, the memories of the last night swarming through her mind. What the hell was she going to do? There was a very real part of her that just wanted to run away, to climb down the tower and disappear into the countryside. It couldn't be that hard to work on a farm. Well, hard, yes, but it couldn't be too difficult to learn the work. If not that, she knew needlepoint and decorative sewing, so she should be able to learn more utilitarian seamstress work. Or maybe she could work as a tutor for a lower-level noble children. Though, of course, then the new... I messed that up a little bit. Chapter 3 Mirka woke to her new puppy gnawing on his splint. Half asleep, she laughed, pulling him close against her side. "Oh, stop that, Scout!" The puppy barked and twisted in her hands to lick her face. "And were you a good boy while I slept?" Scout barked again, bouncing on her bed. He jumped towards the edge, then bounced back to her, and did it again. "You want to get down?" He barked again, licking her face. She hooked her hand around his chest and set him gently on the ground. He immediately ran, limping to the door, pushing up on his good hind leg to scratch at the surface. "You need to relieve yourself?" She pulled on her dressing gown and took him out to the balcony garden. He ran to the nearest flower pot, pulling himself difficultly up into the pot, and disappeared back into the thick flowering bushes. While he rustled around the plants, she leaned on the balcony rail, the memories of the last night swarming through her mind. What the hell was she going to do? There was a very real part of her that just wanted to run away, to climb down the tower and disappear into the countryside. It couldn't be that hard to work on a farm. Well, hard, yes, but it couldn't be too difficult to learn the work. If not that, she knew needlepoint and decorative sewing, so she should be able to learn more utilitarian seamstress work. Or maybe she could work as a tutor for lower-level noble children. Though, of course, then the new guard would be able to find her far too easily. But leaving would mean abandoning her father, her sister, and her country, admitting she wasn't up to ruling, and admitting that she couldn't be a useful member of the royal family. But far more importantly, at this point, Mirka had no question there was something wrong in the country of Wolvenden. The new guard were entirely in control of the government, and even if she hadn't overheard them talking about killing her, Mirka wouldn't have trusted them to run her country. But what good would staying do? No one was listening to her concerns, she had no power, and she didn't really see a way to power without playing along with a regime that she knew was incredibly dangerous. Mirka had seen too many people go from distrusting the new guard to fervently supporting them disturbingly quickly, and there was no ignoring the fact that the new guard were wizards, powerful ones at that. What if playing along gave them a chance to use magic on her? Mirka had basically no magic herself, and so would be defenseless. She heard a whimpering and looked down to see Scout staring up at her. "It's all right, Scout. I'm just thinking." The puppy pushed himself up onto his hind leg again, paws on Mirka's knee, and she leaned down to pick him up. She buried her face in his soft fur. "What do you think, Scout? Do I play along or run?" The puppy barked excitedly, and Mirka laughed. "I'm guessing you like running." She ran her hand gently down his broken leg. "But you might need to wait a while." He growled, and she smiled. "If I didn't know any better, I would think you understood everything I said." He barked, and she laughed again, running her fingers over his silky ears. Then Mirka heard her lady's maid calling from inside, and she sighed. "Sounds like it's time to start the day. But at least that means breakfast." Tara was just as unhappy to see the puppy this morning as she had been the night before. but luckily Camille seemed to like him. She made sure there was meat among the scraps she brought for Scout, and Mirka trusted her enough to leave the dog in her care while she saw the new guard tutor. It was a nerve-wracking session. The man, Darren, mostly spent the session questioning her, ostensibly to judge her knowledge level in different fields, but it didn't take much of a cynical mind to notice that he was also trying to judge her opinions on the different factions in court. She felt like she was balancing on one foot, trying not to be so anti-New Guard that she sounded dangerous, without going so positive that it seemed unnatural. When he left, she immediately went out onto the balcony, taking the puppy into her arms and kissing him on the head. He licked her face, and she laughed. "Was he good?" he asked Camille. "He slept, Your Highness. He only wake up when he heard you coming." "I'd say he's in love." The girl smiled at Mirka, and for the first time in over a year, Mirka felt comfortable with her, like she was a friend, not a servant and a probable spy for the new guard. "Just to warn you, Highness, Tara doesn't approve." "I've noticed, and no offense to either of you, but I think I get to decide if I keep a pet or not." "Do you know if she told anyone about him?" "She told me, but as far as I know she didn't tell anyone else. Why?" "I don't know. She just did not want the new guard to know about him. Maybe it was just that she had a sudden need for them to know as little about her as possible." The pup was watching her curiously, and when she looked down at him, he barked. She pet him. "But that means you need to stay quiet, all right?" The dog licked her hand, and as silly as it was, Mirka thought he understood. And she didn't think it was her imagination that he almost never made a sound the rest of the day. The only problem was every time she left him alone, he would start chewing at his splint. By dinner time she had had to replace it twice. The second time, she looked down at him, ruffling his ears. "Why is this the only thing you won't listen on?" Scout looked up at her, whining quietly, and she shook her head. "I'm sorry, I just don't understand." The dog blew out an unhappy breath, letting his head drop to rest on her hand. "Oh, it's all right. I'll be able to take it off for you in a couple of weeks. Just be patient." The pup looked up at her as if she had just told him there would be no dinner, and feeling bad, she ruffled his ears again and fed him some of the roast from her plate, ignoring the disdainful huff from Tara. Once again she let the puppy in her room for the night, and when he whined, pulled him up into bed with her. Curled up at her side, the dog watched Mirka carefully, its soft blue eyes intensely focused. When her eyes closed and her breathing slowed, he pushed himself up and stepped out of the protective circle of her arms. He limped on 3 legs over to the edge of the bed, and, glancing back, jumped down. He landed in a heap on the ground, growling quietly before shaking himself and staring up at the bed, as if to check that he hadn't woken Mirka. Then he sat down, pulled his leg around in front of him, and started gnawing at the splint. The princess had tied it tightly the last time she'd replaced it. He growled in frustration. It should be easy to break. It was just embroidery thread. But it was tight enough that it was hard for him to get his teeth under the knots. But he was determined. Mirka woke confused. It was clearly the middle of the night, and she wasn't sure what had woken her. Her hand reached out to find Scout and found the spot where he had been cold. She looked down. Someone was kneeling on the floor by her bed, one arm draped over the mattress and his chin resting on his arm. Mirka sat up, a shot of fear jolting her full awake, especially when she realized the man was naked. He was smiling peacefully, and as the light from the night lamp caught her eyes, she let out a tightly held breath. "Did I startle you?" he asked. And Mirka hit him with her pillow. "Of course you fucking startled me! You were a dog when I went to sleep!" She curled back against her headboard, pulling her sheets up to cover herself. This was not all right. She had let him sleep in her bed and watch her change. To make things equal, she leaned forward just enough to glance over the edge of the bed at him. When her eyes tracked back up to his face, he was grinning impishly at her. "Woof," he said, raising one eyebrow. She hit him with her pillow again. "You're a wolf." He nodded, brushing his soft blonde hair out of his face, still smiling at her. But she was not smiling back. The royal wolves of Wolvenden were a breed apart. According to the myths, they were descendants of the goddess of the forest herself, Lo. Everyone knew they were able to take two forms, either canine or mostly human, but it was slightly lesser known that they could alter their wolf shape pretty drastically, smaller or larger, more dog-like or more wolf-like, depending on need. There were limits, and it never would have occurred to Mirka that they could manage something as small and tame-looking as Scout had been. But the young man kneeling by her bed matched the dog, sweet, playful, and surprisingly cuddly. Even in human form, the wolves weren't entirely human. They had ears that were significantly more pointed than human, and fingers and toes that ended in something that was far closer to claws than nails. They had sharper canines than any human, as well as an additional set replacing a set of incisors. They were all at least slightly stronger than human, with significantly more stamina and stronger senses. They also had been the ruling family of Wolvenden for most of recorded history, right up until Mirka's father had taken the throne. Mirka's heart stopped again. Etienne Den? The young man's grin kinked to one side. You can call me Scout if you prefer. Mirka shook her head. Etienne Den was the second son of the previous king, Jourdan Den. He would have been the second in line to the throne if Mirka's father hadn't taken it, and he was sitting naked on her floor, watching her with a stupid little grin on his face. I'm surprised you recognized me. We haven't seen each other since you were 5 years old. He grinned again. I've grown up a bit. Mirka felt herself blushing. That was the grin of a man who was more than aware of his own beauty. And he was stunningly attractive. Those lovely blue eyes that had looked so sweet on the puppy practically glowed in Etienne's softly tanned face. He had lashes longer than any girl Mirka had ever seen, and high cheekbones on either side of a straight nose. His blonde hair was thick, and just long enough to brush across his broad shoulders. But it was really his grin which was so dangerous. Boyish and playful, Mirka was already having trouble not smiling back whenever he grinned at her. She forced that smile back off of her face. You have? When she had last seen him, he had been little more than a babe, toddling along behind his older brother, his soft blonde curls bouncing with every step. Even if he hadn't shared an undeniable resemblance to the portraits of King Jourdan still hanging in multiple places throughout the palace, he looked enough like the child he had been to make the connection. Why are you here now? Etienne's head dropped to one side, as if to examine her from another angle. My leg got slammed in a door, and broken. You took pity on me and patched me up. Did you forget? He grinned again, and Mirka fought an entirely out-of-place giggle. I thought you were an innocent puppy, which you are not. Why are you in the palace? Because I didn't want to leave yet. He leaned forward, and she had no doubt that he was being deliberately dense. You know, you are very pretty. Mirka lost her train of thought, finding herself just smiling at him. Can I stay by your side, at least for a little while? She almost answered before she could give it a second thought. His hand reached out, his fingers running down the side of her arm to her hand, which was resting on her own leg. She looked down at his hand so close to her thigh and let out an undignified squeak. I want to be closer to you, Mirka. He wasn't sitting beside her bed anymore. He had pushed himself up, leaning closer. For a moment, Mirka leaned in as well, and then she took a deep breath, pushing herself back. Etienne, why did you come to the palace? The young man sat back, though he did not relinquish the hand he had taken while she was distracted. I came with my brother to see your father. Reagan wanted to talk to him about the recent spat of demon attacks. Demon attacks? His head tilted the other direction, his eyes still staring into the depths of her soul. Has no one told you? You know that for the last 20 years or so we've been having an unusual number of demons come down into the kingdom every winter, right? Well, this year they have increased tenfold. They've seen 15 already in Pinefall alone, and it's barely spring. Mirka had not known about the demon attacks. She vaguely remembered when she was still allowed to go to court, hearing peasants coming to plead aid from the crown for a demon attack, but no one had treated it as strange. She had assumed it was relatively normal. She certainly had heard nothing about the attacks increasing. And what does that have to do with you or your brother? Etienne's golden brows dipped briefly down, then he shrugged. Fighting them alone is getting tiresome, and it is really something the king should at least be looking into. Mirka stared at him blankly, but he just smiled at her and continued. King Cinna kept trying to arrest our messengers, and so we had to risk coming ourselves. But it was worth it to get to see you, Mirka. He leaned forward again, his eyes locked on her face, and she felt a blush rise from deep inside, straight up to her ears. I like you, Mirka. You barely know me. He smiled sweetly, his hand sliding up her arm, the sensation of his hand on her bare skin like pleasant fire along her nerves. I know enough. Mirka felt herself leaning forward and pushed back. No. This was just too strange. Etienne pulled back as if burnt, his expression that of a kicked puppy. Mirka couldn't help reaching out to him, her hand clenching his. His hand was large, but somehow seemed to fit hers perfectly. She forced her eyes away from their interlocked fingers back up to his face, and those dangerously beautiful blue eyes. You weren't here to take back the throne? Reagan never intended to get involved at all, but when the people came to us, we couldn't ignore them. He was perfectly happy just to follow Father's path and let those who wanted to rule do so. And hell, we all knew that Cinna was an adequate ruler. His smile quirked up on one side, but it wasn't a happy smile. It would have been nice if he had stopped trying to kill us, but I do understand the impulse. My father never tried to kill you. Etienne shrugged. He did, numerous times, starting from when he took control of Wolveden to just a few weeks ago. No. Mirka shook her head, scooting backwards into the headboard. It was a peaceful revolution, a bloodless transition. The royal family survived, because my father chose to leave rather than fight and risk civil war. But the army has tracked us down every few years. Cinna never seemed to believe that we weren't planning a coup. No. She shook her head. This wasn't possible. It was one thing to believe that her father had fallen down in the last few years, that the new guard was controlling him and leading him down the wrong path, but she couldn't accept this. No. My father led a peaceful revolution to take power from an inept king who couldn't rule his kingdom effectively. She should just shake it off, ignore his words. Hell, no, she should call her guards. This was an enemy of the crown, sitting naked on her floor, feeding her what had to be lies to turn her against the throne. It had to be lies. He was still looking at her with those earnest eyes. Mirka, he sighed, and finally his smile slipped away entirely, leaving behind an expression that was almost as lovely for all its lack of joy. Do you know why your father took the throne from mine? She closed her eyes, reciting the lesson she had been taught dozens of times. Because King Jourdan had grown selfish and ignored his people. Etienne shook his head. In the end, it came down to the fact that he refused to marry his line to Cinna's. What? Dauphine was promised to Reagan? Etienne laughed. Of course not. That was the problem. He settled back onto his heel, and Mirka tried to ignore the fact that that position gave her a much better view of the body that had been lurking below the edge of her bed. Holy hell, the man was gorgeous. It started back when my father had just taken the throne. He had no mate, no heirs, no wife, nor seemed likely to gain any in the next few years, which made the nobles nervous. Cinna and a few of the other nobles had recently been visiting neighboring kingdoms and had brought back with them the idea of arranging political marriages. It seems they saw the nobles of Larka and more marrying into the royal family and thought it was a great idea. They suggested to my father that if he had not found a mate by the time he turned 30, that he marry a girl chosen by the nobles, specifically Cinna's younger sister, Michaela. But he didn't. Her eyebrows pulled down. I don't actually know who your mother was. Which was odd. But I know she wasn't Aunt Michaela. Exactly. Because wolves don't do that. We choose our mates by love. And while we will resort to making an heir with someone that we are not in love with, if we cannot find a mate, it is always our choice. Father agreed to their terms to get them off his back, and only on the condition that he would only ever promise to make an heir with the girl, not necessarily marry her. When his 30th birthday was approaching, one night he was out on a hunt, got separated from the group, disappeared for nearly 3 days, and came back with a tinker's daughter in tow. My mother, Ellie Carter. She was his mate. And the nobles were not happy about it. They tried to say that father had gone mad, or had been bewitched by my mother, that she wasn't worthy of the royal line because she was a peasant. But she was far from the first king's mate to be a peasant. Of course, there were dozens of peasants in my family line, and dozens of merchants, soldiers, and nobles. But Cinna's faction thought they had found a new route to power, marrying into the royal family, and days before the king was going to have to bend to their will, he finds a mate who is the antithesis to their demands. Instead of getting an embodiment of the strong ties between the royal wolves and the nobility, they got further proof that the throne was excessively allied to the peasantry. From what I've been told, the day my brother was born, your father came to mine and insisted that in exchange for the continuing support of the nobility, my father had to promise Regan would marry his daughter. My father refused, because wolves don't do arranged marriages. Mirka shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. But my father did not take the throne until Regan was 9 years old. Because Regan and Dauphine weren't the breaking point. We were. What? When father refused to marry off Regan, nothing much came of it. But when I was born, Cinna came to him again. And King Jordan said no again. Of course. Though, from what I understand, ironically he phrased it, it would be entirely up to them if they ended up being interested in each other. Ironic? Why? Etienne smiled up at her through his long gold lashes. You know why. He pushed himself up again as if he needed to be close to her. Mirka, can I kiss you? Her face went bright red. What? No. I mean, not now. I barely know you. I met you less than an hour ago. You met me over 20 years ago. You were 3. That doesn't count. Then you met me 2 days ago. At best a day and a half, and you were a dog, which really doesn't count. He sat back, sighing and dropping his head back onto his arms. Mirka knew what was happening. She wasn't entirely sure she was all right with it, but she knew. When Etienne spoke of finding a mate by love, he didn't mean the love matches people usually spoke of, meeting someone you are attracted to, getting to know them, and liking them enough that you chose to build a life with them. Wolves made almost supernatural connections to their mates, often instantly on first meeting. No one was sure what sparked the connection, something intellectual, visual, or even olfactory, but when wolves fell in love, they fell hard. It was even one of the things that her father had claimed as a reason they were unfit to rule. Every wolf was going to act like an idiot for a while when they first found their mate. There was legitimately incidents in the past when wolf kings had made piss-poor decisions because they were in love. There was even a war that started because a neighboring king was rude to a wolf's mate. Though, even before she had grown suspicious of the new guard, that had been a point Mirka had questioned. Both humans and wolves made bad decisions when in love. Mirka looked down at the naked royal wolf staring up at her, swallowed, and skirted the problem. So you're saying that my father launched a revolution because your father refused arranged marriages? Etienne sat up, offering her a sweet smile. Honestly, I think the version you've been told is what Cinna believed. He saw my father's refusal of any marriage arrangements as complete disregard of the will of the nobles, who he saw as the natural leaders and voice of the people. And that's why the wolves never tried to take back the throne? Because he had a viable point? Etienne raised an eyebrow at her, and for the first time, Mirka felt like he was looking at her rationally. Is it viable to consider the nobles disregarded because you acknowledge peasants? No. Father chose not to make any attempt to reclaim the throne because there is no such thing as a bloodless revolution. And Cinna was an intelligent and credible leader in both the army and on his own dukedom. Trust me, we would be leaving well enough alone if it was well enough. So you are admitting you're planning a coup? Etienne sighed, tapping his fingers thoughtfully along her hand. Mirka realized she was still holding his hand, but did not let go. Mirka, you have to know things have gone too far. With the darkness creeping in, the demons on our borders, the plague, the drought, and the subsequent famines, this isn't about who's sitting on the throne anymore. He reached out, cupping her cheek in his hand, and Mirka instinctively leaned into the touch. Regan is planning to take back the throne at this point, but that's not because of your father. It's because of the new guard. I promise you, we have no intention of hurting you or any member of your family. There is no such thing as a bloodless revolution. He pushed himself up onto the bed, not distinctly closer to her, though it sure as hell felt different. I won't let anyone hurt you. Mirka placed her hand on his shoulder and pushed him gently back. Etienne, think about what you're saying. You are talking about usurping the throne from my father. Do you think promising we won't get hurt means anything? You think my father is just going to step aside? Well, I hope he would, but we both know Sin is not in charge anymore. The new guard have him completely under their power, and we can't leave him in control of our country. It didn't matter that Mirka had been thinking much the same thing for days. She didn't want to hear someone else, and especially not Etienne, say it. This time she didn't hit him with her pillow. She punched him. He barely reacted, his hand rising up to rub at the point of contact on his cheek, but she hadn't even managed to knock him off balance. She wasn't weak, but wolves were annoyingly sturdy creatures. Tears dripped down her cheeks, and Etienne slowly pushed back up onto his knee, watching to see if he was doing the right thing. He wrapped his arm around her back, pulling her close against his chest, and she curled against him and swallowed a sob. Are you all right, Mirka? Of course I am. Blushing, she pushed him back, and he let her, retreating to arm's length. It would be entirely understandable if you weren't. Mirka fought the urge to reach up for him again. She wanted to let him hold her and let him take care of everything, but she knew she wasn't being rational. And she knew why, though she skirted that thought. I'm fine. He continued watching her for a moment, clearly trying to decide if he believed her. After a moment, he shook his head and took a deep breath. I've stayed here longer than I should have, Mirka. Because of your leg? Mirka asked, a hint of desperation in her voice. Sure, because of my leg, Etienne agreed, though it was hard to ignore that it looked almost healed. There was little to distinguish it from the other except a faint line of bruising and the fact that Etienne was still favoring it. Mirka felt a shot of embarrassment. Wolves were able to greatly speed up their healing by transforming back and forth between forms. That's why he had been trying to remove his splint. It had been keeping him from taking care of his own wound. He was still smiling at her as if it weren't her fault. The point is, I need to get out of here before someone realizes that your new pet isn't a pet. Will you come with me? What? I can't protect you if you stay here, and you know you are in danger. I can't abandon my family. Etienne sighed, sitting back on his heels, which without the bed between them made for a distracting view. My brother is probably worried about me. It sounded like it hadn't occurred to him before, and Mirka couldn't stop herself from laughing. Etienne's smile glowed bright, and Mirka found herself smiling back before she forced the expression off her face. Then go home. Mir, I don't want to leave you. I want you to be my bait. For just a second, Mirka's heart stopped. Then it started beating so hard that she was sure that Etienne could hear it. I know you like me too, Mirka. I barely know you. Etienne shrugged. Can I kiss you? She opened her mouth to tell him no, but heard her voice saying yes. He leaned forward with that gorgeous smile on his face and kissed her before she could backtrack. It was a quick kiss, but she felt it all the way down to her toes. See? You like me. But there is a difference between liking you and being ready to run away with you. You don't seem to be listening to this, but I barely know you. You've had a couple of days to figure out whether I'm the person you want to spend the rest of your life with, but I haven't. But I need you to come with me so that I have the time to convince you. He turned that grin on her again, and against all logic, Mirka giggled. Still grinning, he kissed her sweetly on the tip of her nose. Love you, he murmured, and God bless her, she believed him. Can I hold you? Mirka sighed, knowing she was never going to be able to refuse him for long. She nodded, and immediately his arms circled around her. It felt amazing. His arms were warm and strong and reassuring. She sighed into his shoulder, loving the feeling of his hair tickling her face. Then she felt his lips on her neck and his hands sliding down her back to rest on her hips. Etienne, Mirka murmured. half warningly. But her hands were on his shoulders, and it was hard to ignore that he was naked and seemed excessively interested in her. She glanced down, blushing hard, but when she looked back up, Etienne was grinning impishly at her. "Can I touch you?" he asked. Mirka tried to slow her heart, which seemed to be beating impossibly fast. "You already are." "You know what I mean." She did, and she knew she should say no, but she nodded, leaning into his touch as he pulled the sheets down off her legs. She gasped when his fingers found the skin of her legs and traced up. It felt like every nerve in her body was tingling, and she knew that there was going to be no backing out unless she stopped him now. And she just didn't want to stop him. "Etienne," she managed to gasp out, and when he pulled his face off her skin to look at her, his eyes were half-lidded, clearly barely focused on her words. "No biting, all right?" "Not yet." The wolf nodded, then leaned forward, kissing her again, and pushing her gently down onto the bed.